Hello everyone and welcome back to Artefacto YouTube channel where we help you master your painting skills. My name is Alison Pinto and today we're going to talk about some of the biggest mistakes beginners make in watercolor. I've been teaching watercolor painting for many years and understand the problems and difficulties that beginners face with this very unpredictable medium. By understanding these mistakes, we're going to discuss what to do and what not to do so that you can develop the confidence to play around on your own. I recommend you watch this video until the very end so you don't miss any important details.
The first question my students usually have is this: why does my paint keep moving into other areas, creating a mess? This is a classic beginner challenge, paint moving into unwanted areas. This is called bleeding. Artists often find that their painting has gotten messed up because the paint has spread into an area it wasn't supposed to. This is one of the most frustrating challenges an artist faces when beginning in watercolor. So let me show you what I mean and how to keep the bleeds from happening. So here I've made a square of this gorgeous color, Rose of Ultramarine, and I'm putting in an outline. And as I go in and add my pigment here, you can see sometimes you're doing your best to stay inside the lines, and especially if you have a lot of paint, it can start bleeding when you switch colors. And working on the outside of it and you're being super careful, but it starts bleeding anyway. If you're concerned about one color getting blended with another, paint first with clear water into the space that you want to fill, like this. And then I drop in my pigment, and even if you aren't going right to the edge with the pigment, the watercolor will still go to the edge where the water is. But notice how it doesn't cross the edge of the shape. It will not go past that, because you know what is not outside that shape? Water. Watercolor travels through water. It will not go where there is no water, and that's the key. To put it simply, the pigment flows through a wet space into a wet space. So we are going to wait for this to dry. Now that this is dry, notice how I'm able to paint very close and even touch the edge of the previously painted area, but there's no bleeding this time. So now you know the secret. Watercolor will not go where there is no water. And look at the difference between the two. One is bleeding into the other, creating messy edges and the patches in your painted area. And the other has a clean, crisp edge. There's no bleeding. So that's what we want. So that's how you keep it from bleeding outside when you're doing your paintings. Sometimes this bleeding can look really interesting if you do it intentionally. But if you want to control where your paint goes, then make sure the surrounding areas are dry before you paint next to them.
Here's the next question that I got asked. Why do I get blooms, cauliflowers or backgrounds? Let me share one of the things I wish I knew when I was starting in watercolor. There are different drying stages. I used to think that watercolor was either wet or dry, but nothing in between. But guess what?
As soon as you apply watercolor to paper, it starts its journey towards drying. This means it slowly changes states from wet to moist to damp to nearly dry and finally to fully dry. Understanding this process is a game changer and one of the biggest challenges most beginning to mid-level artists struggle with. Knowing how this works is crucial to preventing blooms, especially when you want to go back in and rework an area that you're painting. So how do you prevent these blooms or backgrounds? The best way to prevent blooms or cauliflowers is to actually learn how to make them. So let's give that a try, shall we?
Are you looking to improve your skills in watercolor? So here's a tip for you. Learning under the guidance of internationally acclaimed masters of the craft is the best way to become proficient in watercolor painting. That's why I'm excited to invite you to sign up for a free registration of Nicholas Tobias's Watercolor Painting Educational Marathon. This is your chance to gain valuable insights and techniques from one of the best in the world. Plus, you'll receive a special bonus just for signing up. Click the link in the video description below for more details and to secure your spot.
So to give you an example, this is what blooms typically look like, where it pushes back the pigment and you get edges, sharp edges created from the pigment. And if you want to use it creatively, it can be a very interesting effect to use. So now we will learn what creates the blooms in order to understand how to avoid them. Essentially, we'll put in a wash and we'll give that a few minutes to settle in while I add another color.
You can see how the sheen is right now, and we will come back to it in a few minutes. So as you can see, the sheen has settled in slightly, and what we're going to do is we're going to just drop in clear water and see how that works. You can see it pushes back the pigment, and that's what creates your cauliflowers when you have a different consistency of water versus pigment. We'll do the same thing on this side. And you can even experiment and drop in a few dots and dabs here and there and see how that looks. It's a very interesting exercise to do. So now we're going to let this dry and come back to it and see how it looks once it's dry. So now you can see once it's dry the effects of the water pushing the pigment back and creating hard edges. So this is what we call blooms or cauliflowers. Now, how do we prevent these? The lesson that we've learned from this is, one, that you need to maintain your paint consistency. So whatever is on your brush and on your paper have to be the same consistency. For example, if I'm putting in this wash, the consistency on my paper has to be a certain wetness. So now if you've taken time to remix a paint, again, the time that you've taken over here means that the paint on your brush is a bit wetter than the paint on your paper. So the wetter paint tends to end up pushing back. It tends to push back the pigment that is on the drier part of the paper. So that's how you get blooms. So here are a few lessons we've learned from this. Number one, maintain paint consistency. Ensure the paint on your brush and the paint on the paper have similar moisture levels. So if it's been a few minutes since you applied the first layer, the paint on your paper may be drier than the paint on your brush. And the wetter paint will end up pushing back the pigment of the first layer, and then you develop blooms. The second point is control your water usage. Avoid using too much water in your mixes, because if the paint gets too dilute, it can create blooms over a damp area. So you add too much of water in your mix, and then as it dries unevenly, so you get blooms in the area. So we're going to let this dry and come back to it. So this is how it looks once it has dried, and you can see it has got an uneven finish to the surface, and this happens when your paper might have warped a little bit and the paint collects in certain areas. If there's too much water in your mix, then this is the result that you'll get. So it's a good idea to practice the water to paint ratio so you can easily create transparencies and opaque mixes, and this will help you feel more in control of watercolor as a medium when you're using it. The third challenge and a question that I often hear from artists is, why does my watercolor painting look muddy and overworked? Now, this is a key factor to consider because the beauty of watercolor lies in its transparency and freshness. Once that is lost, watercolor loses some of its charm. And there are various reasons why a painting can look overworked. So let's explore some of them. The first one is constantly touching an area while working on it. This is the biggest reason to make a painting look overworked. So once paint is applied to the paper, going over the same area while it is wet. So we're going to just apply the paint to the paper. And then we can tend to keep touching it again and again in an effort to maybe correct the edge here, maybe touch this up here. We keep touching it in between to make sure it's looking better, but what we end up with then is a very patchy look, and that's basically what leads to overwork. Touching up repeatedly or brushing it too many times. Even if I'm using the same paint and I'm coming in and I say, okay, this is looking a little bit this, so this is looking a little faded here, let me just brush this up, and immediately you've got patches happening. So the tip is you want to apply it once, and then you do not touch it again till it is dry. So this helps to avoid an overworked look and avoid the complexion of the paint getting disturbed. Another aspect of this is also accidentally rubbing your paint or scrubbing your paper while you're working. It can also lead to a very overworked look where you disturb the fibers of the paper by scrubbing too much, and the paper starts to disintegrate due to the friction, and you have this spilling happening which kind of destroys the complexion of the paper. So the tip is to apply the paint once and do not touch it again till it's dry. This is the secret to achieving a clean and fresh look to your painting, and you get a beautiful finish like this. Another reason for an overworked painting is when there is patchiness in a wash. So you may put in your color and then you're trying to make a wash, but then somehow your consistency of wash is different because maybe your paint got over and you've gone back to mix it. So that leads to patchiness in the wash. So a good solution is to mix bigger puddles of paint to ensure that you don't have to remix color in the middle of a painting. The time taken to remix the paint can increase the drying time on the paper of the existing work. So when you go back to the painting, what happens is the difference in the wetness on the paper and the wetness on the brush can actually create patches or a messy look. So you create a bigger puddle of paint, you work quickly, and you go in once. And another good way, you keep testing your color on the paper. So you can understand the thickness, the saturation, the hue, so that when you're going back, you don't get a color difference when you're mixing fresh paint again. So one shot, mix a large puddle of paint for the proportion of area that you need to paint. In fact, mix a little extra and then you go in. Using a smaller brush for larger areas. Now this is the third reason that ends up leaving too many strokes and effectively makes the area look overworked. So I'm exaggerating it a little bit here, but you get the idea. It just simply doesn't look as uniform and as together as you would like your wash to look. So the best way to overcome this is to use large brushes. You could use any of the larger size brushes, and preferably with hair that is softer and works well, especially when re-wetting an area. So you use a larger brush, and the faster you cover an area, the less patchiness you will get. So using a larger brush proves to be very effective. Let's discuss the next reason for a painting to look overworked. Number 4 is adding a new layer before the previous layer is dry. Now this is a pretty common reason for a painting to look overworked and can happen to even seasoned artists, particularly when you're in a hurry. So what I'm going to do here is I'm putting down a base layer first. So while we wait for this to settle in and dry, I'm going to just take some tissue and dab out an area just for fun, and we'll wait for this to settle in a bit before we go in with the second layer and see how that works. Now you can see a little bit of a background happening here. Why does this happen? Because water has accumulated here. Now what happens is typically we would go in with our color and we'd probably try to make up that space. Can you see? There's a little bit of a background happened here. You would try and fix that. But invariably, when you go into an existing wash and the level of drying is different, if you can see here as well, there are differences in the tonal values. And if you go in there and touch it again, you're going to get kind of a patchy look while the paint is still wet. So sometimes the surface of the layer looks deceptively dry,
And often due to lack of awareness or lack of patience, we rush in to add another layer. And this process can dilute the lower layer, or it can even pick up from the lower layer. As you can see, it picks up some of the pigment and it creates patchiness or a muddy appearance. You could try and fix some of this, but as you can see, each time you try to fix something, you end up damaging something else. To test if the surface is truly dry, use the back of your hand. If it is cool to the touch, it's still not fully dry. And if you're in a hurry or you're not sure, it's a good idea to blow dry it. The reason you use the back of your hand is because our skin has natural oils and you want to prevent marks from your fingers on your paper. And if you must go over an area, you need to wait till it's absolutely dry, otherwise it will mix with the previous layer and become muddy, like you can see. Now we're going to try this again on the other side. And we can blow dry it. Now I'm going to put in the second layer, and a good tip for you to keep in mind is when you're doing your second layer is to mix your pigment so that it is as dark as you would like it to be the first time, dark enough so that you don't have to go back in again. Now you can see I have a nice clean wash happening over here. So I'm going to pull this in closer so you can see how going into a previous layer that is not fully dry can create patches, because what happens is it actually disturbs the complexion of the previous layer on the paper and you get muddiness, you get hints of the lower color coming through. Generally, if you try to correct it, you end up making more errors and more disturbances to this complexion. Preserving the complexion of your first wash is very important. Like you can see on the other side, we preserve the complexion, and so the next layer is done on an absolutely dry paper which we've blow dried, and so you don't get any disturbances of the lower layer coming through. I use a lot of layering in my technique of painting, but I don't usually end up making mud, and the reason for that is even when I think my painting is dry, I blast it with a hairdryer for a few minutes to make sure that it is. And I try to paint delicately with soft brushes to make sure that I don't disturb the complexion of the paint that's already on the paper. Lastly, let's talk about another very important aspect that can ruin paintings. I've saved this for the last because it's a subject that's dear to my heart. And what is that? Mixing too many pigments. When you refer to muddy colors, it simply means a dulled out color. We've lost the signature freshness and vibrance that makes watercolor stand out from other mediums. So how do we avoid that? Much of this is about learning how to mix and work so that you get pure color on the page where you want it. And the goal is to get luminous colors. So even though you're mixing on the page or on the palette, you're getting luminous colors that shine through and make your painting look fresh, glowing. That's a signature look for all watercolors, is the glowing colors. So one of the first things that beginners struggle with the most is pigment choices, and using too many pigments can lead to mud. Each pigment has its own unique properties and characteristics, and when too many pigments are used, then they mix together and the resulting color can become overly complex and it can lose its vibrance. So instead of a clear bright hue, you'll often get a dull grayish color. So let's understand how. When you mix two single pigment colors, in this case nickel azo yellow, which is this beautiful transparent yellow, and again a single pigment blue, which is a phthalo blue, you're going to apply it here as an example, and you're going to get a beautiful fresh green. Most colors have single pigments. However, colors such as indigo, sepia, and many other convenience shades are made from multiple pigments. When you choose colors that have more than one pigment, like say a convenience green, in this case Cascade Green is made up of two pigments, which is raw sienna and a phthalo blue. So if you put a convenience color, which is more than one pigment, and then you add in another convenience color, in this case it's burnt umber. If you paint with colors that have more than one pigment, you'll very often end up with a potentially muddy look. So the best way to avoid creating mud is not to mix too many pigments together. Limit your palette and choose colors that have single pigments. To give you another example, I'm going to take another single pigment color, which is phthalo green, and I'm going to mix it with a transparent shade to get a kind of a warmer green. Now if I take the same mixes in a convenience green and I try to mix it with we still won't get a really nice fresh green look. So you can see the difference. This one has a bit of glow to it, whereas this one completely kills the light. And that's what very often will make your work look a little bit overworked. The pigment codes are often written on the side of the tubes, like in this case you can see PY150, and if not, you can always, the easiest way is to go to the paint manufacturer's brochure or website and look it up, and you will always see the pigment codes like here PV29, PR176. So the pigment codes are written in the brochure. When I mix paint, I try not to use more than 3 pigments in any one mix. So that's a key to keep in mind. Another tip is when you mix complementary colors together, they can mix lovely grays. But if you're inexperienced, they can also become mud. So if you mix a blue and an orange, you get a dark neutral. And if you were to mix, say, a red and a green, you get a grayish brown. If you were to mix a purple and a yellow, again both sides of the color wheel, right? So if you were to mix a purple and a yellow, you get a brown which is like almost khaki. But mixing complementary colors without making mud takes experience. So test it out first. If you must use a color with its complement, test it out on a piece of paper and try it out first and see how your colors mix. Experimenting is a wonderful way to learn to overcome this. Thirdly, here's another way that can create mud. If you're using too many granulating colors or opaque colors, you often end up with a flat and muddy effect. Opaque colors tend to overpower a transparent pigment, as they usually have more gum arabic and maybe white and some other pigment added, and calcium carbonate, which basically renders its opacity. So that means if you mix them unawares on your painting, you might get some grays. But if you mix them with awareness, granulating pigments with awareness can be really beautiful, can give you beautiful results. So to give you a quick example, if you take a transparent color, the opaque color, when laid over it or with it, has the tendency of overpowering or even muddying the pigment. So you can see the transparency and the freshness of your pigment is completely gone. This side it's fresh and this side it turns kind of grayish. So opaque colors tend to gray it out. To find out whether your pigment is opaque, you can look at the tube, or you can definitely go back to the manufacturer's brochure, where you can check out in some of them it'll be a square, in some it'll be a circle. The circle which has nothing in it means it's a transparent color. But in cases where you see the whole thing is blocked off, or black in this case, that means it's an opaque color. So that's a great way to help you assess whether your colors are transparent or opaque and what to use at which times. So here's a quick tip for you. To avoid muddiness, try to limit your palette to a few harmonious colors. Mix them thoughtfully, stick to single pigment colors when starting out, and use granular colors or opaque colors with caution. A good way is to experiment with mixing small amounts of paint and see how they blend before you apply them to your artwork. Put in mixtures, try it out. and experiment and then get into your painting. I hope that's helpful.